Hey everyone, welcome to our session on the Patreon left and the Democratic Party here at Organizing 2.0. That's our annual conference for activists and organizers, digital stuff, organizing, and all of the above. Today's session is definitely more media focused, and we're lucky to have as our special guests Ben Dixon, who is the host of Like It or Not and the Ben Dixon Show. He's been around for a while doing media. And we also have coming Alex Lawson, who writes for the Substack Week State and is a DSA activist in central Vermont. She's having an issue getting on right now, so she'll be joining us in just a few minutes. But we are going to get started with Ben. So first of all, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure is mine. Thanks so much for having me.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll start off right away with the meat of it. I'm going to present what I hope is both a fun caricature, but something real about what we're talking about, which is that we have seen in the last chunk of time that anyone, any bozo, can start a YouTube channel, a podcast, a Substack, or whatever, run around posing as being part of the legitimate left while taking positions that are so contrary to what the institutional left, call it the advocacy nonprofit complex, thinks and wants to do. That there's this real tension developing, and ultimately the tension is about who is a legitimate spokesperson for issues. Someone with a tech-savvy initiative and privilege to become a media personality, or organizations and institutions that represent an actual demographic, a constituency, a membership that's paying dues, which would apply to like a lot of unions, a lot of organizations, but definitely doesn't apply in the same way to people that have amassed a following doing their own very personal media. Is that the right framing that you would go with?
Yeah, I think there is a competition that's happening right now. And I think it's a natural competition, but I do like the framing that you gave it.
So one of the questions I have is if there's going to be open warfare between these two parts that are both contained within the left, and just for the record, I'm using the word left in a really big tent way, meaning anyone who thinks that they're left, that's okay, you can be left, rather than trying to figure out who's in or out. But it strikes me that if you look at some of the folks that have been criticized, I'm thinking of Jimmy Dore, but obviously that's not the only one. It's a weird question because they actually do have a constituency. They may not be a traditional membership organization, but in what sense is a group of 1,000 or 2,000 or even more donating every month on Patreon? How is that different than a membership organization where people are donating 5 or 10 months to belong to it?
Well, I think it's different to the extent that membership organizations collectively have mechanisms through which they can get the opinion, the collective thought of their audience. And so I have the expectation that membership organizations are more responsive to their audiences, to their members, than even someone with the Patreon account. While I personally hold myself accountable to my patrons, there's no physical requirement for me to do so. There's no document, there's no articles of incorporation or constitution or any type of amendments that forces me to listen to my patrons. And so while there are some parallels, I think there is a disconnect there. There's an important difference, because if you think about DSA and the way that they collectively hear from their members, totally different than someone who has patrons.
But at the same time, I feel like there's an aspect of the evolving internet and social media that has worked really well in some instances. And I'm going to give an example, and let's not take this analogy too far. If you have a situation where people have an identity that's very isolated where they are, say young LGBTQ kids, in rural areas, the internet was a magnificent tool because it allowed them to aggregate, even though they might be isolated in where they are, and then in the aggregate exercise a collective voice on places like Tumblr or Twitter or wherever that really amplifies their power. And most folks who do what we do are like, that's a great example of how the internet was really helping to advance our social issues in a positive way. But now you have the ability of, say, people who have a view that's extremely controversial on the left, I hesitate to choose an issue, but let's say supporting Syria against its enemies, let's say, which is definitely a minority view on the left. It may be very small numbers of people. They may not have a large membership organization to amplify their views, but they are able to find their most ardent supporters online, aggregate those voices, and then have an outsized impact. So in a sense, if there's any ideological perspective that is small in numbers, but willing to put in the work, they can have an outsized impact on the discourse. And it feels like institutions that have to carry more weight in terms of their responsibilities and relationships they're having circles being run around them because they can't respond anywhere near as fast. They can't say exactly what they think, and they're constantly waiting to see what their allies and peers think before going off, with what their own opinion is. It feels maybe like a bit of an insurmountable tension there.
Yes, in that the internet, I want to separate between the internet in general, where, let's say, social media, where everything that you outline is absolutely true. You can find comrades online, and whether or not you're associated with an organization, you're able to collectively find each other, organize, and make your opinion heard, and quite frankly, felt on social media. But I want to make sure we separate that from social media influencers who may have a Patreon and a YouTube, where they are the quote unquote leader of a subset of that group, versus individuals who found themselves collectively online and are collectively speaking with a unified voice.
This might be the distinction between the mooks and the knights, if you catch that reference. But there's a great paper out there that describes an ecosystem in which knights, who are basically people with a high profile and lots of followers, they benefit by sending their followers, known as the mooks, to basically brigade against others or support their perspective. And in a sense, it's a weird terrain where politics as we know it has been converted from real actions in the real world to a bunch of internet virtue signaling against other camps of internet virtue signaling across the ideological spectrum. And I have a feeling that madness lies that way, but the volume of it just keeps on going up year after year. And just hold that thought, because I do want to introduce Alex, who just showed up. Alex, thank you so much for coming. We mentioned that you're writing for the Substack Week State, and I know you've been listening, so you're caught up. But I just want to ask, do you have any thoughts about the way that this question is being framed? These two sides, the legitimate, honorable, have members and an institution behind them, versus the unhinged leftists with a Patreon account who say whatever they want to, and it's a problem because they're saying it wrong. Just a moment. I think your voice is not coming through.
I think
Start over.
I think the problem is that, on one hand, you don't want to gatekeep who's allowed to make media. And of course, there's a giant kind of gap in the media for leftist voices for the most part, and in bigger media anyway, and having influence that way. But on the other hand, you don't want to have people that are so desperate to kind of cultivate their own audience that they almost intentionally seem to turn people off to other audiences, and maybe things that are action items for people, or don't lead them off a cliff and into kind of just despair.
Well, I think there's a real difference between AOC, who you could look at as if she was a media superstar, because the way that she does her social media definitely fits into that category. But she uses that power in a way that is very consistent with her efforts as an organizer and a congresswoman. The identities there blur into each other, such that when she has political influence, she also has troops that are being thrown into the political arena as it exists. And in contrast, influencers and YouTubers, whatever, they have the privilege of only participating in the media side of things without having any of the responsibilities that come with accountability and members. And that freedom is both something that drives other people nuts, but it's also like a really valuable asset. And what's funny about this is what people ask me, in planning for the session is, so what's the advice that we give to organizers? I mean, we have political actors that we agree with who are looking at this arena and they're asking, what do we do? Should I be reply guying to every single influencer, maybe to Benjamin Dixon? Should I be cultivating relationships by figuring out what those folks want? Like, how is the left that is focused on organizing supposed to relate to a portion of the left that's decided that its main contribution is in the media sphere?
I think that's a brilliant question, actually. And my suggestion, if you would allow me to think it out with you all, would be the cultivating of relationships, but without being beholden to anyone, right? So, same thing that I do, right? I'm in that latter group where I'm a media influencer and I'm answerable basically only to my supporters. And to the extent that I decide to be answerable to my supporters. And so I think the appropriate relationship is for no one to be subservient to the other. Which means that while, you have organizers who may not have as much influence on social media, I mean, they have influence in places that media personalities generally don't have that kind of influence, right? You have the praxis versus theory, you have online versus praxis. And so, I mean, I don't think that they should worry so much about not having that influence as much as cultivating meaningful relationships with people in those spaces, but not reply guy relationships, but standing in what they do well, which is organizing in the real world versus the rest of us who are only in the digital space.
Alex, did you want to add to that?
I totally agree with that. I also think one of the things that's really important is to, as organizers, is to lift up the voices that are giving action items to regular people, that are kind of inspiring them a little bit more. Because I mean, I feel like, the outrage machine can only go for so long. So if you keep lifting up voices that are more hopeful and give people something that they can do, it can pull them out of that everything's awful and it's always going to be awful, nihilistic, sphere that I think is being cultivated in some circles.
Right. One of the thoughts that I had watching the vitriol directed at Jimmy Dore, but I don't mean to poke at him in particular. I mean the whole force the vote range of personalities that were weighing in against AOC, is that a lot of them have personal experience of kind of not being allowed at the cool kids table. And the result is that when they have a microphone that gets bigger and they build an audience, they have no affinity to the leaders of what I'm calling the more legitimate left, by which I mean organizations and institutions that have a membership that that's consistent over time. And it makes me think that maybe the response to folks like that ought not to be, how do we denounce them as hard as possible so that they shut up and go away, but really to sort of ask the question, when we're excluding these voices and not being in dialogue with them and not modeling respectful dialogue, aren't we therefore sowing the seeds of more outrage machinery to come in the future?
Are you asking that from the perspective of the organizations as it pertains to media personalities?
Yeah, what I'm thinking about is the famous phrase, if you don't want someone to be outside the tent pissing in, you have to make an effort to bring them inside the tent so they can piss out. And the feeling that I see in my circles of hostility towards the media influencers that won't, quote unquote, fall in line with the, I'm going to call it the mainstream Bernie left, that vitriol, I feel like it started before the kerfuffle. It started when certain media personalities, certain shows, I'm thinking of Chapo Trap House and True Anon Pod in particular, they basically were like, you know what, we don't agree with a whole bunch of quote unquote, our allies on the left. So we're going to say what we feel about them and denounce them and advocate for a kind of messaging, maybe involving snake emojis, that drives a lot of people nuts. And so, if you don't like it, suck it. But the response doesn't have to be unmitigated hostility and response. The response could be a question. Well, how would we connect with that audience to get them to be more nuanced than the host that they're following? How would we connect to those hosts to generate a human relationship in which that kind of naked hostility is less likely to be prevalent? And I feel like the institutional left personalities are in many ways rejecting that kind of advice. And instead, they're leaning into the conflict, which I worry about as something that will basically make it harder and harder for us to unify.
You want to go first, Alex, on that one, or you want me to go first?
I don't want to be too, I guess I don't want to draw a hard line, but there's certain people that I feel like it's like it's too cynical. Like, I don't know how to draw them back in. Maybe some of their audience you can, but I feel like a lot of people are just kind of like irony poisoned and just can't, they just can't be pulled back from it. But then there are others that are just new to this, and maybe those are the people that they listen to because they were new to this, like, progressive politics or whatever. And those people, I think the best way to draw them in is just to give them an alternate side. Like, okay, this is the more pragmatic, hopeful side of this thing, versus like the clicks. And I think it's really important to recognize that whenever you write an article or have a podcast about AOC, your Patreon dollars go up. So that's why, like, there's been a ton of pieces in the past week or so, is because it makes money. It's more interesting than saying, like, HR 1, is a really important bill that we should organize around, or let's call it the PRO Act. Talking about what a sellout AOC is going to get 1 million more views. So I think, like, there's bad actors, and then there's just people that are, like, drawn into the cynicism because the government hasn't worked with them for so long. And I think it's really important to kind of, like, parse those two things.
Yeah, I agree. Definitely to parse the difference between the two, but then also, if I would be so bold as to give the organization's advice, don't pay media personalities any attention. Keep organizing. Keep staying in the real world. Keep finding people who want to actually do work versus just scream at a screen. Because if you engage too much in the media world, you're going to have to make an analysis of what critique is coming in good faith and which critique is coming for clicks. And once you're forced to make that kind of analysis, you have sucked away so much of your time and your energy that, quite frankly, you should just give to the streets. So I would say, as far as it's concerned, there are going to be people who have valid criticisms of your organization. If you could hear them, hear them. But then there are also people in this space that, honestly, they're bad faith actors on every side of every ideology. And I think we need to just come to terms with that. Everyone who says they're on the left is not engaging in good faith, and they don't have good intentions for leftism. So stick to what your charter says, focus on what you're designed to do, and don't worry about the criticisms, but do seek out good faith critiques.
This is a great question. How could you set out a list of instructions for telling the difference between good faith and bad faith? And I don't mean, Twitter accounts generated last week. I mean, there are people with serious disagreements who are constantly attacked for having bad faith. And what tips can we give to well-meaning people to understand the difference? There may not be a good answer to this, in case you're wondering, but if you want to tweet it out with the hashtag org20, org20, let us know, because I think so many conversations go back to, but was it in good faith?
You may not be afforded this opportunity, but the real good faith test is when the answer contradicts or challenges your personal power. It's not really a good answer because most people will never reveal that. But when telling the truth costs you something and you still tell the truth, you're generally operating in good faith. When telling the truth is going to cost you patrons and you won't say it, or if doing this particular topic gets you more money and you decide to do it. For example, it would have been in my best financial interest if Donald Trump got a second term, right? But I absolutely could not, in good faith, have done anything else except fight against Donald Trump. Now, there's some people who would have rather kept Donald Trump because it would have helped their bottom line dollars. So I think that's the best place when making a decision is not in your best interest and you make it anyway. And the same thing with these analyses, right? We break it down. Like, there are analyses that are going forth that are profitable, and then there are those that are not profitable. I think you should find out which ones are not profitable and see who's on that side of the equation. And then that might be a decent test. It's not universal. It's not comprehensive, but I think it's a decent test.
Right. Yeah. Alex, do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, I mean, Ben said it better than I probably will, but for me, it's calling balls and strikes. Like if the Biden administration, who nobody wanted, right? Like none of us as leftists wanted a moderate administration, but if they do something good and you don't recognize it, like to me, that's the clearest indication that that person is just operating on outrage and, you know, like outrage dollars, because there are good things that have happened. The child benefit thing that's coming up, for example, is going to help millions and millions and millions of people. I feel like if you're never calling balls and strikes and you're always like in that doomer mode and everything's wrong, it's just, you're not giving a balanced critique and you're just milking your patrons for all the, you know, anger dollars you can get.
Yeah. And one other thing, if all you say makes your audience happy all the time, there's a good chance you're not operating in good faith, because there's no way that you can speak truth about what's going on in society without making your audience upset every now and then.
Right. Speaking of outrage, I'd like to try something, Alex, with your permission. And I note that I didn't ask for it really, or wait for you to give an answer, but I'm just to try something out here live. I was reading a Nathan Tankus Substack article in which he said that he was leaving Substack because it's a terrible place and they're guilty of trans misogyny and they're bad. And anyone who has a large audience that stays there is contributing to bad things. Sorry for not being more specific. And here you are, a Substack writer. And it would be so easy for someone who had just read the Nathan Tankus article to then tweet at you and say that because you haven't left that platform and moved to Ghost or something, that there's something wrong with you. When that kind of an argument, do you see it as perfectly legitimate, helping move things along, or as an example of a kind of like a very internal, very, very refined discourse that isn't really advancing any sort of mass politics?
I actually think it's a fair critique, and I think that like if you can't back up your own reasons for doing things, then you know that's a problem. I think as we're moving into new media, things like Substack, we have to decide when is it worth it to stick around on a platform to challenge so that it doesn't become an echo chamber of you know deplorable beliefs, and when is it time to move on from that platform. And that's a nuanced conversation, but one worth having, because we are seeing a lot of journalists move into new mediums, and we're seeing a lot of people, you know, again on the left, you know, moving into new mediums like Twitch, and I think it's important to have that conversation about when is it worth it to stay and when is it worth it to leave. I think a problem is not willing to be challenged, you know, and that's another thing that I see sometimes with certain
Greenwald
personalities. Yeah, you know, you should be willing to be challenged, and you should be able to stand on your, you know, on your beliefs. You know, and I don't think that. I think there's one thing to call somebody names, and there's another thing to say, "Hey, why are you staying on this platform? Like it's problematic," or you know, and ask the person to engage with you.
Right. Well, I'm going to shift gears a little bit here and talk about one of my favorite creators in this class. That's Natalie Wynn of ContraPoints, which, by the way, is a really easy, shallow answer because of how popular and good her videos are. But one of the things when I think of her is that it started off being kind of a niche stream of content that was attracting people interested in trans issues, people who are transitioning. Like there's clearly some sort of strong connection between that community and her creation, even with all the drama that's taken place. But she broke out to an audience that's, you know, a gazillion times larger than that niche, because she stayed true to her voice, true to her vision, and because it was authentic and unique, it was able to grow. But I look at the work that you've been involved in, Ben. You aren't just doing, you know, YouTubing or podcasts or whatever. You're doing Black YouTubing. You're doing Black podcasts. You are elevating a constituency as a media personality. But the chances of it breaking out the way that Natalie Wynn did, I would say, I'm just guessing here, they might be a little bit different. And I'm just thinking about the fact that if we're using a media machine that large corporations have designed around engagement that supports outrage and that follows the wisdom of the crowds, I feel like that's a permanent bias against what you do and people like you. How do you deal with that? What are we going to do about this? as a group of people that want other voices, non-mainstream dominant voices, to break out.
Were you at my staff meeting last week or something?
No, I usually never get to talk about this. That's why there's a panel here.
No, it's great, man. Listen, like I'm in a precarious position where I don't know what video, it's a popular video, but they say, oh no, it's an episode of Philosophize This. And he's talking about the Frankfurt School. And he was talking about one of the worst things that you could do as a content creator is to say stuff that challenges your audience, right? So I have a double whammy. I do focus on the Black experience, Black content, and then generally speaking, we just cover the news, but we're Black. And not only are we fighting against the algorithm, we had a guest this week who actually found that in YouTube's advertising model, they actually block social justice terms from being monetized, right? We had suspicions about it, but they found the evidence of it. So we're at a disadvantage. But I mean, at what point in my life or in Black people's life in the country have we not been disadvantaged? Like we've always been taught to be twice as good to get half as much. And so, I mean, I don't think about it often, but it's there. And how do we fight it? Well, consistency. I think that's one of the biggest things that I have against probably a lot of content creators, especially people who started off with me 6 years ago in our class. There's not a lot of people who started off with me who are still doing it. So consistency and excellence, and we just keep fighting, and then some luck, because if it wasn't for me stumbling onto the Michael Bloomberg story, I probably still be working 3 jobs and doing the content that I've been doing for the last 6 years.
So Alex, I'm going to sort of turn that question just a teeny bit in your direction and say, one of the things that could be said in response to that issue of, whose voices get to be heard is that, we have a country with a lot of different political tendencies. In the left, we have people who care, more about one thing than the other. I mean, name your favorite anarcho-syndicalist podcaster, quick. Well, it's not so easy because the way that we think of sort of the content creator cloud and the way that we think of all the divisions and historical, tendencies that exist in the left. And I want to be clear, I'm not restricting that to what some people call the white left, but like really in a broad way, it's almost like those two things aren't aligned with each other. That we have a media sphere that gets to say whatever, do whatever without any historical context, without following in the footsteps of. People don't know how to say that such and such a voice fits in the mold of or follows such and such. And that allows them to be incredibly inconsistent over time, to not have benchmarks that they can be held accountable to, because the audience is often not really measuring them against, what it fits into. And in contrast, every organization that comes out in the world, well, they have a board of directors. You can look who they are. They have they have relationships with other groups or politicians that they have to coordinate with to get their work done. They have maybe foundations that they rely on. It's an incredibly uneven playing field. I almost want to ask you, do you think we should be doing more to get left content creators to be more explicit and specific about what tendencies they belong to, where not something as ludicrous as saying everyone who's an anarcho-syndicalist has to say so, but just to help make it easier to categorize and label people in meaningful, real ways, as opposed to floating above it all, throwing a pot shot in any direction that you want, and then never being able to be held accountable for what you're actually about.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that would be helpful. Like, obviously, an anarchist is going to have a different view of the way we should handle things, and even a socialist, basically, whether the state should exist or not. I do think that that's important. I think one way maybe to do that is to encourage more kind of like cross-pollination between podcasts, because then you can talk about your beliefs and maybe somebody that has that's also on the left but has a different conceptualization of what a good society would be like, can challenge those beliefs, and you guys can talk about it. And I think that's different than a debate and bro, which is kind of like a cringy thing. But I think it's important to be able to defend your ideas and to be able to try to cross-pollinate with other creators that maybe challenge those ideas. And that might help with the misinformation or disinformation that I see kind of floating around in some circles of media. Like sometimes just historically getting things dead wrong, which is frustrating.
Alex, do you think that there ought to be more media criticism, media journalism that is by, from, and about this content creator universe that we're talking about? Like, would it make sense for, Mediaite to be covering beefs between YouTubers? And I ask that because it's almost funny asking the question out loud because it's a little bit ludicrous. But on the other hand, if you have two YouTubers with 1 million subscriptions each fighting over a meaningful issue, like whether or not Medicare for All ought to be promoted one way or another, I don't think we could argue that that's not a politically relevant, conversation to be covered. But like when I went looking to see who's covering the breadtube beat, I mean, it's really thin pickings. It's a Reddit used for self-promotion by anyone who wants it. What are we missing here that would actually be helpful for organizers and everyone else in the ecosystem to make heads or tails of what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think some kind of a watchdog situation might be a good thing. I don't know to what extent, but I know that exists for other, media spaces, but not so much on the left. I have a friend that actually talks about doing that, kind of like breaking the arguments apart and seeing, Force the Vote, even though it didn't get a lot of popular support outside of Twitter, it did make it to AOC responding to it, Pramila Jayapal talking about it on Ryan Grimm's podcast. So these conversations, but then most of DSA hadn't heard of it because they're not on Twitter. So yeah, I think these conversations should have somebody maybe like keeping an eye on it or a finger on the pulse of what's going on.
Right. Ben, did you want to add something to that? I mean, how about this, Ben? Would you agree to join a professional organization that certifies you as a legitimate YouTuber, and if you join it and then you mess up later by doing something that the rest of them don't like, they can kick you out and it would have super adverse impacts on your business? Would you want that, or would you see that as a threat?
I mean, it totally depends on how that central committee is organized. As with everything else, that authoritarian central committee, it's got to be organized right. To that end, though, I think there's something to what you're saying. I often think about this. What's happening on Twitter is meaningful. Anyone who says that Twitter is not real life, they're not really being honest or just engaging in bad faith, because, we have the ability to sway the conversation, even if it's just by small degrees, by how we engage on Twitter, as well as YouTube and all these media influencers. And so I do think if we're lucky enough to have, like, let's say 50 years from now, we're still here and climate disaster hasn't destroyed us. I think in retrospect, there will be plenty of PhDs and dissertations over this period in terms of the factions of how people identify themselves, which content creator clearly identified themselves versus who was hiding. This is who they really were by virtue of what they said all the time. I think there's going to be plenty of analysis of this moment because of the outsized impact that we're all having on the national political conversation. But that's only if we are lucky enough to actually have some retrospect by having 50 years in the future, and we haven't destroyed
Right. Well, impending doom aside, I'm thinking about whether if we could go back in time to 2007 and tell someone who wants to start a blog that they shouldn't because, that blogging thing is over. And in 2007, that was actually a common opinion, and it was completely, absolutely wrong. And in the same way, if anyone were to announce on Twitter, I'm starting my new podcast, the immediate response is like, oh no, like, what's wrong with you? Because there's so many, and people might say to someone who looks like me, Charles, we don't really need your voice and your face out there trying to generate more attention for what you think. Wouldn't it be better for you to not do that in order to let other voices thrive? Which I'm not sure is a logical progression, but that's definitely a view that's out there. Are we at the beginning of an even longer tail where larger and larger fractions of our attention are consumed by this elaborate landscape of producers? Or have we kind of hit the peak? And now that the two of you are in the business, like, you have a shot, but anyone joining today is probably not going to make it.
I mean, such as everything else in this capitalistic system, right? So I thought back in 2015, 14, December 2014, January 2015, when I started my show, the reason it took me so long to start it was because I felt like it was oversaturated and I didn't have anything unique to add to the conversation. I was clearly wrong. I think if you are getting in this to make a career out of it, you better be good. Just be excellent. If you're getting into this because you just want to say what you have to say and you want what you say recorded on someone's servers for as long as those servers exist, let's say those servers are here in 1,000 years, but then cut on your microphone and record. I mean, I wouldn't really make the decision based on how many views and how many listens you can get so much as you have a permanent record of what you believe.
You're taking a bold stance here in favor of people just doing what they want to on media as a method of self-expression without being subject to the discipline of either the marketplace or the political.
Oh, the marketplace is going to take care of everybody. And this, I mean, listen, besides the algorithm not being a true marketplace, it is a dog eat dog world. And if you're good enough, you can maybe survive. That's about all you can, if you're twice as good as everybody else, you can get a foothold. So I wouldn't dare say anyone not give it a shot, but I would say only give it a shot in so much as you genuinely cannot hold your tongue. If you have something that must be said, go say it.
But Ben, I just let's make this real. So I start my YouTube channel and I get about 17 views per video. Am I living my best life because I got to, do my art? Or am I victim to some sort of syndrome of taking oneself too seriously?
I mean, it depends on your art. Like I legit started with, hell, I'm still 99% of my operations are still funded by what I scrap up together and put together every month. Like everyone's thinking like, for the longest, they're like, oh, is he being paid by George Soros? How is he surviving? I survived with 2 jobs and a podcast, right? And so the reward for me for for 5 of the 6 years I've been doing this, the only reward I got was that, oh, more people listen to me today than yesterday, right? Started off with 2 listeners. And I know this, like if there's a bootstrap story in leftist media, it's me and it sucks, right? But the reward was I got to go back and listen to when I made good points and I didn't even realize I was making good points. I had a chance to talk to people. I had a chance to meet with people. I had a chance to connect and I just stuck with it. And I think the stick-to-itiveness is what actually helped me break through more than anything else. So it does suck when your videos only get 17 views, but I mean, shit, excuse my language. I mean, I had like 3 years. It took me 3 years to get 5 patrons. So
Right. Well, that's a good metric. If you can get 5 patrons in 3 years, you're doing better than me. As Ben Dixon. Yeah, there we go. So Alex, I'm shifting this just a teeny bit for you. Would you say that you're a content creator that also does organizing, or that you're an organizer who also has a media outlet?
I think of myself as more of an organizer, but I do want to start creating more content just because I want to see more hopeful voices, and I want to direct people to wins, because wins feel good and wins to get more wins. And right now, I think people are caught up in like what could have been and what we didn't get, and we are winning things, and especially on the left, you're not used to winning, but we are winning things more and more. And I think it's important to highlight that. There's actually a viral tweet that just went around of the DSA, I think it was like in 2018 or something like that. It was Robert's Rules of Order, and like somebody was asking that people not do this because they have sensory problems. Somebody else was asking for something else.
You're talking, wait, hold on. I just want to help the audience understand. Do not Google DSA convention Simpsons outtake animated video, because then you'll know exactly what we're talking about. Continue, Alex.
So anyway, they said they're not getting anything. They're never getting anything done, or something like that was the viral tweet. And then somebody else responded with, "We've won 147 elections." And so, so I think it's like really cool that we actually are winning stuff. We just got somebody else on the PRO Act, Angus King, to sign on to the PRO Act. We are winning, and I want to see more of that centered in media, because those local victories, like all politics is local politics. Those things I don't see like getting enough of the spotlight, and everything is like federal, federal elections and that kind of thing. But we are winning locally. We are winning federally, like we are nationally.
Well, this is interesting. Say something more. Tell us more about how you function as a media content creator, as a local organizer person. In other words, talking about the happenings in central Vermont and in Burlington, and I'm contrasting that to Ben here, who, you're in Atlanta, to the best of my knowledge, and a lot of your guests, a lot of your content like uses the fact you're in Atlanta and Georgia as a base. But I would never have categorized you as a local media person from Atlanta.
Right.
I want to hear it first from you, Alex. Like, explain the mechanics of being that local person, given that everything's in the internet for everywhere. And for all most of the people paying attention to your Substack are not, in fact, from Vermont and do not necessarily care about Vermont.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I don't really talk about local politics on the Substack or anything too much, except that it is an interesting place because I live in Burlington, which is where Bernie lives, and it's really progressive. We have our own progressive party. We've replaced the city council with all progressives, and we're working to defund the police. Like, we're actually moving really, really progressive legislation through. So it's a good way to talk about like what you can do on the local level if you get the right people in, on a very microcosm level, and apply that to other places. If you want to defund the police, it's not about electing, reps. It's about changing your city council. So it is good to use that as like a test example of like what can be accomplished. And it's a lot easier to change out city councilors than it is to get a senator elected. So I like to talk about it in that way, as just kind of like Burlington's a really good example of a place that is in like has all the best things going for it. So you can see like what is possible. But I don't talk too much about local politics on my Substack or anything, because again, like you said, people live all over the place, except to just encourage that, if you're fed up with dealing with looking at like senators and whatever that are obstructing everything, then, focus locally, focus on what you can do on the ground, because you can make a huge difference in your local community that you can't make on a federal level.
I'm hearing from you a little bit of the act locally, but media globally. Ben, what's your take here?
Yeah, no, I agree. It just so happens that Atlanta became the, ground zero for the special election, as well as important during the general election. And to that extent, I refocused a lot of my platform to bring on local voices that had national impact because of the nature of it. So it was just really good timing in terms of the city that I lived in. But, in general, act locally, just like you said, act locally and have media that is global, because we are trying to build a global consensus, right? We're trying to build a global class consciousness. And so while to whatever extent my local politics can speak to that, we will. And then to whatever extent I can use my large platform to help something that's happening local, absolutely will.
Right. I'm going to move on to some questions from the audience in Zoom. Most of our sessions were all done in Zoom, but I'm going to read one here. Can I be a hinged leftist who doesn't have any institutional backing? Which is almost like, I just imagine the polite young, I'm going to make an assumption that it's a man who's like, okay, I want to be one of those content creators, but I want to be friendly, with the tastemakers. But in my head, it's like, and I'm not the expert to answer this, the two of you are. In my head, it's like, dude, if you want to get an audience, you have to not follow the tastemakers. Like, the whole point of how social media and content works is that if you're not beefing, if you're not running against a dominant paradigm, then you got to find some other paradigm you can be against.
Or you could just offer something totally different, which is rare. It's like a chimera. So, don't chase after it unless you just have it. If you have something different to say, you already know it. And I think that we have to take into perspective any of our dynamic leaders who have things to say. They probably will come through media because of how democratized it is and how decentralized it is. And so I think we should take care not to dismiss small platforms but to listen as often as we can, because I think there are unique things that are being said by people with 10 subscribers. And that's why I never turn down an opportunity to go on and speak with someone who, somebody's first podcast, like their first episode. I love being on first episodes because you never know how unique that person's voice is. But to answer the question, to be hinged and not unhinged, just operate in good faith. And when something does not agree with you, it's okay. Don't reject everything simply to protect your territory, because then you become unhinged.
Alex?
Yeah, I guess the only advice I would give is, I don't think you have to publicly beef with anybody. You can totally disagree with tactics and just, just choose to operate in a positive way. But I think that the thing to look out for is when you're asking yourself, like, should I compliment this thing that's happening that's good in government because it's going to piss my subscribers off because they, because they think I'm complimenting Biden. Like, the second you're running it through the committee instead of saying what's like the truth for you, I think that's kind of like your audience should be able to rely on you to tell the truth no matter what. And I think once you're mentally running it through that committee about, are you going to lose subscribers or whatnot, you kind of lost something there. So I think just be true to yourself and to your voice.
And that's good advice. I fear it will not work well enough on young people who haven't found that for themselves and often, are still in the process of maturing to get there. And they're also the most likely to just do it anyway. But I want to offer a contribution from the panelist that I couldn't get, Natalie Wynn. And one of the hallmarks of her work, which I'm praising, is in a landscape where people are often attacking the folks they oppose, ad hominem attacks, coming up with fun labels for why these people suck and ought to be mocked, and strawmanning their arguments, basically attacking them for things that aren't exactly what they meant. She Ironmans or Steelmans her opponents. She looks for the best, most powerful argument that she disagrees with, presents it in a way that resonates, that is accurate and meaningful, and then argues with it respectfully. And doing that against people as nutty as white nationalists is part of why she is mentioned frequently as one of the best things on YouTube, in that it can actually pull people back from the red pill, pull people back from the manosphere, and bring them back into a differentialized willingness to stand up to fascists and racists, which is a powerful thing.
That's why I like Natalie so much. Like I do engage with her work a lot, simply because of how much good faith effort she gives to people who have no intention of engaging in good faith with her, right? It takes a lot to be willing to do what is necessary when other people are cutting all the corners. And I'm only repeating and saying this because, you know what, Natalie, I think I'm going to do that from now on. I think I'm going to Iron Man their conversations. It takes a lot of energy, but why not at this point? Because so many people are engaging in bad faith that maybe the only answer to bad faith is like the highest of faith, where we take them, give them the greatest benefit of the doubt. Because this is the one thing I find, I did find this out debating, I think it was Sargon of Akkad many years ago. I debated with that dude. Even when I gave him the benefit of the doubt, they were still wrong. So why not?
Right.
Let's do it that way, because they're still going to be wrong.
Right. Alex, by the way, we only have about 7 minutes left and we are going to end on time. Go ahead, Alex.
No, I think that is probably the absolute best way. I've definitely been guilty of just firing off when I see some really bad takes and really bad takes. But if you think about not that person, not the media figure, but the people that maybe have been led astray by that person, then you can be more charitable, because those people a lot of times are just kind of new to this stuff. And then they find somebody whose voice they trust, and then that person is telling them things and they're like, oh, I guess this is true. So if you kind of take that, like, this person's disappointed in politics and, all the stuff that gets you to that place of feeling nihilistic and angry, and give them the most charitable interpretation, then maybe you can pull them back from it and say, okay, like, I recognize this feeling, but there is this that you can look towards, there is this that you can move towards, and there are these wins, and there are these good things happening, to kind of bring them back in. So yeah, I think it's better than mine for sure.
All right. I'm going to jump in here with a fun one, and let's take our gloves off here for this one. So I'm going to take a step, and not with 100% seriousness. I'm going to denounce the Tucker Carlson left. So listen to me, Tucker Carlson left. You go on his show. The guy's a white supremacist, and you're supposedly a leftist who cares about all the right things. I can't handle it. Like, are we deplatforming these people? Are we? I'm thinking of Crystal Ball and Sagar. I mean, I feel like this is such a conundrum. Why wouldn't we want to go onto the enemy's camp in order to broadcast our views versus why would we ever give credence to our enemies' positions by showing up on their views? And when we, it's almost like these secondary boycotts. Well, you went on that show and you went on that person's show and then you went on that person's show. So you're all fascist and I'm canceling you all. What's the way out of this conundrum? Or should, and I hope you don't say this, should we just not talk about it?
No, we can totally talk about it. I think what is said, right? Because right now I'm super unpopular with the faction of the left because I went on MSNBC. Dum, dum, dum. Okay, but what did I say? The first time I went in favor of Bernie Sanders because I was trying to help get him elected. And so what has happened is that in some cases we decontextualize what the conversation. And I feel like if we analyze people based on their conversation, well, sure, it's going to benefit me because I always keep the truth. I just tell the truth because I got a bad habit of telling the truth. So of course that benefits me, but how's that going to benefit people who go on Tucker Carlson? All right. So why are you there? Are you there agreeing with him? Are you there tacitly endorsing what he said the night before? Are you not challenging him? Like, what is the context of what you're doing there? Because would I go on Tucker Carlson? You're absolutely right, I would. And I would go in there as vitriolic and to oppose everything that he stands for. So of course he's not going to have me. The point is, what do people say when they go on these programs? And are they buddies with the enemy, with people who are clearly aligned against the best interests of so many marginalized groups? Are you there just chuckling it up with them, or are you there challenging them?
So Ben, are you asking me for advice about how to better persuade Tucker Carlson's audience? All right, that's not a real question.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, Alex.
Yeah, I mean, I echo all of that. That's exactly what I was going to say is that, if you're going there to also trash AOC on top of, what Tucker says about her, that's one thing. If you're going on there to push back on their bad ideas, I think that's okay. I don't think the medium is the message. It's the same thing with like Mehdi Hassan getting his own show on MSNBC. Like that's clearly better than Alex Witt having a show, right? Like I think,
Yes.
if you're going to go on a mainstream liberal TV show and he like has hard-hitting interviews and he really pushes back on a lot of the Democratic Party line stuff. I would take that 1,000 times over like somebody that's just going to nod their head and agree. So I think it doesn't matter what the medium is so much as what you're saying.
Good answers. I'm now going to end with a very speculative question. We're going to go first to Alex, then to Ben, then we're going to end this. So here goes. Alex, when you finally get canceled, what will it be for?
Oh no. Taking an Ambien and tweeting it.
I like it. That works. But be specific. What will you do on Ambien?
Oh man, this is too much.
Yeah. Accidentally carrying the camera roll.
There we go. Okay. All right, that's good. All right, Ben, you're up. How are you going to end up being canceled? And I'm just going to take off the table. We're going to remove anything related to your business operations.
I plead the fifth. I'm pleading the fifth. There's plenty of stuff to cancel. There's plenty of stuff to cancel me over. I just don't do it online. That's the smart thing. You just if you're going to, don't be an idiot online. Don't just leave your paper trail online, folks. You got to dig deep to get me. No, I'm joking.
So we're unified here. Stay classy, people. Those of you listening now or in the future, stay classy. Everyone we're talking to is a human being, and everyone listening to us is a human being watching us deal with other human beings. So above anything else that we've talked about and laughed about in this wonderful hour, it's just be human. Thank you very much for being part of this discussion about the Patreon left in the Democratic Party. We've had as our guests Benjamin Dixon of Like It or Not in the Ben Dixon Show. We've had Alex Lawson of Weak State, who's a Substacker, among other things. And you're all at Organizing 2.0, which has been a wonderful event this year. And I hope you come back next year. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.